The spoon clinked against porcelain 3 times. Frank Lucas sat in Sylvia's restaurant on Malcolm X Boulevard, stirring sugar into coffee he didn't want to drink. His hands were steady, but something in his eyes betrayed the weight of what he was about to do. Across the street, Bumpy Johnson's Cadillac pulled up to the curb with the precision of a man who owned time itself. What Frank Lucas didn't realize was that asking for permission was the most dangerous move of his life. It was February 1968. The snow outside had turned to gray slush, and Harlem felt like a powder keg wrapped in winter coats. Frank had been planning this conversation for 8 months, not because he needed permission, but because in Harlem, there was a way things were done. You didn't just take, you asked. And when you asked Bumpy Johnson for something, you better be ready for an answer you hadn't prepared for. Frank had watched the old system crumble for years. The Italians controlled the supply lines, set the prices, decided who lived and who disappeared. Every corner dealer in Harlem was paying tribute to men who had never walked these streets, who saw black faces only as numbers on profit sheets. But Frank had seen something they hadn't, an opportunity hidden in plain sight, wrapped in military uniforms and Southeast Asian connection. The restaurant door chimed. Bumpy Johnson entered like he owned the building, which he probably did. At 62, he moved with the calculated grace of a man who had survived 3 decades in a business where most men didn't survive 3 years. His gray suit was immaculate, his fedora tilted at the exact angle that said authority without saying arrogance. Bumpy slid into the booth across from Frank. The waitress appeared without being summoned, poured coffee without being asked, and vanished without making eye contact. That's how the world worked around Bumpy Johnson. People anticipated his needs before he expressed them. You said this was about the future, Bumpy said quietly. His voice carried the weight of a man who had heard every scheme, every dream, every desperate pitch that Harlem's ambitious young men could imagine. Frank leaned forward slightly. It's about independence, Mr. Johnson, about changing the rules that have kept us dependent for too long. Bumpy sipped his coffee and waited. In the silence, Frank could hear the distant sound of taxi horns, the muffled conversations from other tables, the rhythm of a city that never stopped moving. But here in this booth, time moved differently.
The Italians, Frank began carefully. They control everything above us. The heroin flows through their channels, at their prices, according to their timeline. Every dealer, from 1110th Street to the Bronx, is working for them, whether they know it or not. Bumpy's expression didn't change, but Frank caught something in his eyes. Not interest exactly, but the kind of attention a chess player gives when his opponent makes an unexpected move. What if, Frank continued, we could bypass them completely, cut out the middleman, control our own supply chain, set our own terms. Now Bumpy set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. When he spoke, his voice was even quieter than before. You're talking about war, Frank, war with people who have been playing this game since before you were born. I'm talking about evolution, Frank replied. I'm talking about Harlem controlling its own destiny instead of begging for scraps from tables we built. What Frank didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson had been thinking about this exact problem for 20 years. Not the solution Frank was proposing, but the fundamental issue itself, the dependency that came with dealing with people who saw you as a customer, never as an equal. The humiliation of having to negotiate with men who would step over your body to avoid touching you, but who wanted your money clean and regular. But Bumpy had also watched brilliant men destroy themselves by moving too fast, by confusing ambition with wisdom. He had seen Dutch Schultz's empire crumble when he forgot that power was about balance, not domination. He had watched Lucky Luciano fall when he stopped understanding that respect was earned daily, never inherited. Tell me about this plan, Bumpy said. Frank's eyes brightened. This was the moment he had been preparing for. I have a connection. Military. My cousin Nicky. He's a sergeant stationed in Vietnam. The Golden Triangle produces the purest heroin in the world, and military transport channels are moving it through bases that the Italians can't touch. He paused, watching Bumpy's face for any reaction. We could bring in product that's 90% pure at prices that would make Italian suppliers irrelevant overnight. Within 6 months we could control the entire Northeast distribution network. Bumpy leaned back against the red vinyl booth. Frank's enthusiasm was infectious, but enthusiasm had buried more men in this business than bullets or badges ever had. But what nobody in that restaurant knew, what Frank couldn't have imagined, was that Bumpy Johnson had already made 4 phone calls before arriving at Sylvia's. One to a contact at the 28th Precinct, asking about federal surveillance on military drug trafficking. One to a friend in the Longshoremen's Union, inquiring about port security. One to a banker in the financial district, discussing money laundering capability. And one to Angelo Genovese, explaining that a young man named Frank Lucas might be approaching Italian distributors with an interesting proposition.
Bumpy Johnson didn't make decisions in restaurants. He made decisions in his office. After gathering information, after understanding every variable that could affect the outcome. The restaurant was theater, a way of making Frank feel like he was presenting something revolutionary when he was actually walking through a script that Bumpy had already written. "Who else knows about this cousin?" Bumpy asked. "Nobody. I've kept this completely quiet. And he's willing to risk court-martial for money? He's willing to risk it for family," Frank said, "and for enough money to change his life forever." Bumpy nodded slowly. Frank's plan wasn't impossible. In fact, it was brilliant in its simplicity. Military connections would provide cover that civilian smugglers couldn't match. The purity advantage would create customer loyalty that price wars couldn't destroy. The profit margins would be unprecedented. But Bumpy thought in systems, not schemes. Every action created reactions. And reactions had a way of becoming problems you never saw coming until they were too big to solve. "What happens after 6 months?" Bumpy asked. Frank looked confused. "What do you mean?" "You flood the market, eliminate the competition, control distribution. Then what? You think the Italians pack up and find a new business? You think federal agencies ignore military personnel trafficking drugs through government channels?" Frank's confident smile wavered slightly. "By then we'd be too established, too profitable to shut down." Dutch Schultz was too established to shut down, Bumpy said quietly. Lucky Luciano was too profitable to touch. They both thought they had built something permanent right up until the day it disappeared. The restaurant continued its background rhythm, but their table had become an island of silence. Frank stared at his coffee, processing implications he hadn't considered. "So you're saying no?" Frank asked. "I'm saying you're thinking like an entrepreneur, not like a survivor," Bumpy replied. "Entrepreneurs focus on opportunities. Survivors focus on consequences." Bumpy leaned forward, his voice dropping to a tone that made Frank lean in to hear. "Let me tell you something about power, Frank. Real power isn't about controlling markets or eliminating competition. Real power is about understanding that every system has rules, and those rules exist because someone with more power than you decided they should exist." He gestured slightly toward the window, toward the Harlem streets beyond. "Right now, there's an arrangement. The Italians import, we distribute. Law enforcement gets their cut. Everyone makes money within acceptable parameters. It's not perfect, but it's stable. And stable systems last longer than revolutionary ones. But we could make so much more money," Frank protested. "Money," Bumpy said, "is not power. Money is what powerful people let you have in exchange for doing what they want you to do. The moment you forget that distinction is the moment you start believing your own mythology." Frank felt his carefully rehearsed presentation dissolving. This wasn't the eager partnership discussion he had imagined, but something in Bumpy's tone suggested the conversation was far from over. "However," Bumpy continued, and Frank's attention snapped back like a rubber band, "there's something to be said for thinking bigger, something to be said for not accepting limitations that other people impose on your possibility." Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook. He wrote something on a page, tore it out and slid it across the table. It was an address in the Bronx. "If you're serious about this," Bumpy said, "if this isn't just ambitious dreaming, then you need to understand what you're actually proposing. This address belongs to a man named Vincent Gigante. He manages Italian interests in everything north of..." Frank looked at the paper, then back at Bumpy. "What am I supposed to do with this?" "You're supposed to go there tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. You're supposed to explain your plan to him exactly as you explained it to me. You're supposed to ask for his permission to compete with his organization." Frank's eyes widened. "That's suicide. That's education," Bumpy corrected. "If you can walk into that room, present your case and walk out with Gigante's blessing, then maybe you understand power well enough to use it. But if you can't handle one conversation with one Italian administrator, then you're not ready for what you're proposing." The weight of Bumpy's challenge settled over Frank like cold water. This wasn't about permission anymore. This was about proving he understood the difference between having an idea and having the capacity to execute it. "And if I don't go," Frank asked, "then you keep working the same corners, taking the same orders, accepting the same limitations," Bumpy said. "Nothing wrong with that. Most people live their entire lives within other people's boundaries." But Frank Lucas had never been most people. The subtle insult was clear. Bumpy wasn't rejecting his plan. He was challenging him to prove he deserved to propose it. "What if I go and he says yes?"
Frank asked. Then you'll learn something important about negotiation, Bumpy replied. And we'll have another conversation about implementation. And if he says no? Bumpy's smile was colder than the February wind outside. Then you'll learn something important about yourself. Frank stared at the address for a long moment. Everything he thought he knew about this meeting had been wrong. He had come here expecting to recruit a partner. Instead, he was being sent to audition for competitors. But as he sat there, Frank realized something else. Bumpy hadn't said no to the plan itself. He had said no to Frank's naive approach to executing it. There was a difference. And that difference might be the key to everything. When I meet with Gigante, Frank said slowly, what exactly should I be asking for? You should be asking for what every man in this business wants, Bumpy replied. Respect. The right to operate within the system without disrupting the system. The right to make money without making problems. How do I convince him of that? Bumpy finished his coffee and stood up. That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself, Frank. Because if you can't figure it out, then you don't understand the business well enough to change it. He placed a $10 bill on the table. 8 o'clock tomorrow. Don't be early. Don't be late. Vincent Gigante doesn't give second chances. And neither do I. As Bumpy walked toward the door, Frank called out, Mr. Johnson, why are you doing this? Bumpy paused, turned back. I'm not doing anything, Frank. I'm watching you do something. There's a difference. The restaurant door closed behind him, and Frank was left alone with his coffee, his ambitions, and an address that would either launch his empire or end his life. 27 hours later, Frank Lucas stood outside a social club in the Bronx, checking his watch. 7:58. The building looked innocuous, squeezed between a barbershop and a bakery, but Frank could feel the weight of invisible attention from every window on the block.
At exactly 8 o'clock, he pushed through the door. The interior was dimly lit, filled with the smell of cigarettes and espresso. A few older men played cards at corner tables, their conversation stopping when Frank entered. You Lucas? The bartender asked. Frank nodded. Back room. Vincent Gigante was not what Frank expected. Smaller than average, wearing a cardigan that looked like it belonged on a college professor, reading a newspaper through wire-rimmed glasses. The only indication of his real business was the complete silence that surrounded him, the way other men moved through the club like satellites around a planet. Sit, Gigante said without looking up. Frank sat in the single chair facing Gigante's desk. For 30 seconds, the only sound was the rustle of newspaper pages. Bumpy Johnson says you have a proposal, Gigante said finally. I have an opportunity, Frank replied carefully. Explain it. Frank took a breath and began the same presentation he had given Bumpy, but this time he understood the real stakes. This wasn't about convincing someone to join his plan. This was about convincing someone not to destroy it. Military connections, Frank said. Southeast Asia, direct import, no middlemen, unprecedented purity levels. Gigante folded his newspaper and studied Frank with the clinical attention of a surgeon examining a tumor. And you want what from us? I want to operate without conflict, Frank said. I want to build something that doesn't threaten what you've built. Everything threatens what we've built, Gigante replied. The question is whether it threatens it enough to matter. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were photographs. Frank talking to his cousin. Frank meeting with potential investors. Frank walking through neighborhoods he thought were private. We know about your cousin, Gigante said, spreading the photos across the desk. We know about your finance. We know about your distribution plans. Frank felt his mouth go dry. How?
The same way we know everything, Gigante said. We pay attention. When someone starts planning to change our business, we make it our business to understand their plans. Frank stared at the photographs, realizing that his secret plan had been an open book to people he didn't even know existed. So, Gigante continued, since we already know what you're planning, the question becomes, what do you have to offer us? This was the moment Frank understood that he had been thinking about the problem completely wrong. He had assumed he was bringing them information they didn't have. Instead, he was being evaluated for a job he didn't know he was applying for. I can offer you something your current suppliers can't, Frank said, improvising. Complete loyalty. Total territorial control. Guaranteed elimination of competition problems. Explain. Your current suppliers work with multiple clients. Their loyalty is to profit, not to you. But if I operate independently under your protection, I work for you exclusively. I become your insurance policy against anyone else trying to enter the market. Gigante leaned back in his chair. You're offering to become our employee in exchange for the right to build your own operation. I'm offering to solve your problems in exchange for the space to build something that benefits everyone. 10%, Gigante said. Excuse me? 10% of gross revenue. Not net. Gross. Every dollar that flows through your operation, we get 10 cents. Plus, you handle all territorial enforcement. Anyone who competes with us in your area becomes your responsibility to eliminate. Frank's mind raced. 10% was expensive, but if he could control costs through direct sourcing, he would still come out ahead. And in return, exclusive rights to everything south of 105th Street, protection from federal investigation, guaranteed supply chain security. Frank stared at Gigante, understanding that this conversation had been a recruitment interview disguised as a negotiation. You have until tomorrow night to decide, Gigante said. If you agree, we discuss implementation. If you decline, we discuss alternatives.
Frank stood up, knowing that alternatives meant things he didn't want to consider. One more thing, Gigante said as Frank reached the door. Bumpy Johnson vouched for you. That means something to us, but recommendations expire if the people they recommend disappoint us. Frank walked out into the Bronx night, his head spinning. Everything he thought he understood about power, about business, about independence, had been turned inside out in the span of an hour. 2 days later, he sat across from Bumpy Johnson in Sylvia's restaurant again. How did it go? Bumpy asked. He offered me a deal, Frank said. 10% of gross, plus territorial enforcement responsibilities. And you said? I said yes. Bumpy nodded slowly. Do you understand what just happened? I think so. No, Bumpy said quietly. You don't. But you will. He leaned forward. You walked into that room thinking you were negotiating for independence. You walked out having been recruited for employment. The difference is crucial, and understanding that difference will determine whether you build something lasting, or something that destroys you. Frank stared at his coffee. So what was the point of all this? The point, Bumpy said, was to teach you the difference between having power and having permission. Power is what I have. Permission is what Vincent Gigante gave you. And permission can always be revoked. Then why tell me to take the deal? Because sometimes permission is the first step toward power, Bumpy replied. But only if you understand it's permission, not power. Only if you're planning for the day when you don't need anyone's permission anymore. That conversation launched Frank Lucas toward an empire that would eventually span continents and generate more money than most corporations. But it also set in motion the forces that would ultimately destroy him. Bumpy Johnson had given Frank Lucas exactly what he asked for, a chance to change the game. But he had also taught him something more important. The game was much bigger, much more complex, and much more dangerous than Frank had imagined. The real lesson wasn't about heroin or money, or territory. The real lesson was about understanding that in a world where everyone thinks they're playing chess, the people with real power are playing an entirely different game. Frank Lucas asked for permission to become independent. Bumpy Johnson gave him permission to learn that independence is something you take, not something you're given, and that distinction would define everything that came after.